Hello, everyone. Boy, can you believe it? Our last lecture, Akbar and Adam. I hope you've enjoyed this semester. I have learned a lot. I hope you have too. Akbar's, he already knew all this stuff, but he's enjoyed it too, he told me. Um, okay, today, what are we doing? Our last lecture, what I thought I would do is first, a little bit in the news. This, as I'm recording this, is pretty recent news. Somalia is set to experience the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded in that area, dumping 2 years worth of rain in 2 days. And then if you read this, not surprising that you'll find climate change mentioned as a factor because they've got extremely warm ocean temperatures over there, and they think that has led to a rapid intensification of this storm. So, we're seeing this stuff in the news. Okay, what am I doing today? And I will try to be quick because you'll have the outline and you'll have the slides if you want to go through them. Really, I kind of want to just put a kind of a greatest hits together, highlights of some of the most important things I think we covered so that you have some of the main takeaways from the course. I'll start with the summary that we had for the class. And then I really just kind of went through and tried to pull a slide from each of the lectures we did or a main idea, and then just kind of weave it together in a short version to just give you a rehash, a recap of what we covered, hoping that that's helpful. Okay, from the syllabus, this is what the course summary said. I thought it'd be interesting to go back over this and kind of self-evaluate. Did we do this? How well did we doing this? How well did we do this? You let me know. I think we did a pretty good job. So we took an interdisciplinary and problem-oriented approach to climate change, and I called that philosophy. And then I didn't ever use this word theoria, or maybe I did. This is what the Greek word for theory, this is what it comes from, is trying to get up and look down to see the landscape and its crucial dimensions and its decisive features. So we didn't really do a specialized take on it. We tried to see how things hang together, and we tried to develop tools for seeing connections and understanding the big picture. So yeah, I hope that you walk away with some maps and tools to help you think and act about climate change. So hopefully that sort of stuff happened for you this semester. We started with this section on getting oriented. We talked about the Anthropocene. I don't think I talked enough about our high energy way of life. This vision of technoscience as controlling nature to liberate and enrich the human condition, and doing it primarily through convenience, convening things together. Electricity, water, food, entertainment, everything being convened for us through this high energy way of life. And of course, that being fueled by fossil fuels, and that leading to climate change. So we started really big picture. Then we talked about philosophy as this problem-oriented way of thinking, that we were travelers following philosophical questions more than we are experts sitting in our own home terrain and coming up with answers. We were really trying to follow the questions and think through them. We got these tools, I'll go over those a little bit. And we talked about climate change as a wicked problem. And at the end, we talked about climate change as a collective action problem. So remember those, I think, are also frameworks or tools to think about climate change. Here's our way of life, right? I don't actually know where this picture is taken. This could be Denton. We have a Buc-ee's. This kind of looks like our Buc-ee's, right? In a way, if you could have one picture for the high energy culture that is spreading across the world, this would be it. Big convenience store, gas station, right? And the question really about this class is, how did we get here, and what are the implications of living this way? And can we sustain something like this way of life? Should we sustain something like this way of life and still manage all the wicked problems, collective problems that come along with climate change? So we also put this in graphic form. Here's the Anthropocene, right? We talked about also the age of acceleration. Look at the CO2 emissions over time. We are on this hockey curve spike. We live in these really unprecedented times. That's, I think, what I want you to take away. I guess it seems normal, but this is so new, it's so recent, it's so big that we need to kind of keep in mind these are fascinating times we live in, full of hope and also full of danger. Okay. Also, the question I want you to take away, what are the justice dimensions of climate change? Because the Anthropocene is misleading, isn't it? That makes it sound like all humans, all anthropos, have created this condition. When we know, as this one chart shows us, Africans haven't created this in equal measure as Americans have, to just give one example. So the disproportionate impacts of peoples on climate, that's a big theme for you to take away from this class. Some call that the capitalocene, those who are enrolled in and participating in and benefiting from capitalism more than others have a disproportionate impact and arguably have a disproportionate responsibility then to do something about climate change. Big theme of the class. Philosophy. Remember when we went through all of these philosophic problems and we said what we're doing is like rhizomes cutting through the soil of thinking? Sometimes these problems pop up and sometimes they dig down to fundamental assumptions that we have, and we're going to follow those. And we went through all of these different philosophic dimensions. And I said climate philosophy is not a separate specialization alongside all the different, say, climate sciences and social sciences. Rather, climate philosophy is this way of traveling, this way of thinking across disciplines. I also gave you these tools from the policy sciences. The problem orientation, I think, is one thing you can take away and use no matter what you're thinking through. It's just a kind of simple heuristic, rule of thumb or organizing device for your head to think about what are the goals at stake here? What are the trends related to those goals? Because if the trends are going in the wrong direction, well, then you have a problem, right? What are the conditioning factors? That is both proximal and distant causes of the problem, of the trends, right? What are the projections if we don't do anything, if we do something different? And then what are our alternatives? What can we actually do? What should we actually do? I also talked about the social process. So if you're ever looking at a complex social problem, these are categories that you probably want to look at. Who's involved? What are their perspectives? What kind of values do they have? What kind of resources do they have? What's the situation that we're in? What's the context we're in? What strategies are the participants using to try to achieve their values and goals? And then what are the outcomes that result from all of this jockeying and jostling around in the political arena? And then we talk about the decision process. So anytime you want to analyze a policy, whether it's by a small company or a big nation state, you've got these different phases, right? And it's not this simple, but again, these are heuristics. There's this intelligence gathering phase where you try to figure out what's going on. There's the promotion phase where different factions are trying to get their decision made. You have the actual prescription, which is the decision. Then you have that decision being invoked, which is to say kind of being enforced by authorities. You have it being applied by court systems, legal systems. You have it then maybe being appraised. Is it doing good? Is it doing bad? And then eventually terminated. So again, just helpful tools. We talked about climate science as a worldview. We talked about modern science as a worldview, right? Nature as a collection of resources that we should control for our liberation and convenience. But we mostly talked about climate science as a body of knowledge. What do we know? As institutions like the IPCC, who figured this out, and methods and tools like climate data, climate models. How did we figure this out? How do we know what we know? Here's wicked problems, I think fits in here. I added this one part. Will my little, see this? And this is from our old slide. What makes a wicked problem wicked is partly we don't know what the problem is. we have a hard time defining it, locating it, settling on solutions. There's high stakes, there's uncertainty, the science and technical dimensions are woven in with the ethics and politics. I added this bit here, this epistemic fracture. It's not just that we disagree about values, we disagree about the authorities and the processes and the institutions to establish knowledge, facts, reality. That's part of the wickedness of climate change. We talked about what climate science can and can't do when we had this section on science and context. We talked about how science can explain the world, but it can't necessarily articulate a meaningful world for us. We talked about how science can disclose new or invisible phenomena. In many ways, climate change is kind of new and invisible. And without the science, we wouldn't know what the climate is to begin with. But the science itself can't really formulate the problem for us. It can't tell us what is the problem, how should we frame it, what should we do about it. Science can give us a coherent and detailed view of the world, but it can't really lead to consensus and action. And so we criticize this linear model of science, of politics as applied science, right? We then talked about politics as a paradox, that something could be both A and not A, the duck rabbit, right, dilemma. And what was important from that is that we don't dismiss all disagreement as just like junk science, say. But we have to be aware also of drawing false equivalencies. Just because you can characterize a situation as A and not A doesn't mean both of those characterizations are equally valid or legitimate or evidence-based, right? We then also talked about politics and propaganda, the role of big money, special interests, disinformation. We talked about not platforming junk science, right? But we also talked about being aware of this cancel culture, being aware of false binaries of creating good versus evil to kind of have a simplistic narrative. The way we put that was this balancing act of we want to have a balance between truth telling and rights defending. I put it, this is a new thing I've been thinking about. Maybe the way to see this balance is we have this funnel in a modern liberal democratic society. We want to defend people's rights to free speech. And that's this wide end of the funnel, you know. But we also need and want, I think, institutions and gatekeepers and processes for testing these knowledge claims that are made at the wide end and funneling them down into things that actually pass the test, right? Authoritative expert consensus. And so at this balancing act, I think, is how can we keep a wide end of the funnel and protect people's free speech, but also keep a narrow end of the funnel and have some sort of shared sense of reality that we can all at least ground our disagreements on some shared facts. So that, I think, is a big challenge for climate change, right? Now, I pulled a couple of slides from, I think, lecture 11, where I try to summarize things in this problem orientation framework. I think another thing to take away from the class is this goal statement by the UNFCCC that we're seeking the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, what counts as dangerous anthropogenic interference is a philosophical question, right? It has scientific dimensions, obviously, but how you frame that will depend on all sorts of things, including your risk perceptions, and a lot more, cost-benefit analyses, discounting of the future generations, all this stuff. So if that's the goal, though, then we talk about trends, and it's obvious that we're trending towards more CO2 emissions, more CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, which really, no matter how you define dangerous anthropogenic interference, whether you think it's near or far, we're heading in that direction. Right? Talked about the conditioning factors directly, fossil fuel consumption, the companies behind that, right? But indirectly also this way of life, this deeply held philosophical assumptions about what a good life is and the role of consumption in that. We talked about projections, and I think it's clear that current policies are likely insufficient to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference. We might have even lost our chance to hit that 1.5 C target. So what do we do about it? And that's where there's lots of debates. Overall, though, what we're trying to do is decarbonize the global economy, right, as rapidly as possible. But that obviously has both costs and benefits that need to be thought through. And they're going to be sometimes costs for somebody as a benefit for somebody else. So it is political. This is the other one I pulled. How do we understand dangerous anthropogenic interference? Well, the IPCC, as we know, has been putting this in terms of temperature increases above pre-industrial levels. And that means then there's this kind of carbon budget idea. And then this idea of, well, that budget is shrinking. Every little bit of carbon we put in the atmosphere means we have less of a budget remaining, right? And then that introduces these three main modes of action on climate change. Well, we can keep fossil fuels in the ground through mitigation efforts, and there's lots of different kinds of those. We can put, that's like putting a lid on the bucket, right? We can drill a hole in the bottom of the bucket through these negative emission schemes or other versions of geoengineering. There's also this reflective solar radiation version of geoengineering. And then what I don't mention here, which I should, is adaptation. No matter what we do, climate is always changing, and it's likely to be changing more drastically in the future. So how much of our money and time and energy should we put into adaptation measures? Okay, then we talked about this linear model. Here's science. I'm sorry, here's politics as applied science. Remember this one? Shouldn't science lead to knowledge, lead to political consensus? We all have the same facts, and then it leads to wise policy action. And then we said, well, I don't know. What about uncertainty? What about the different media? That after all, we want free speech, right? And then we said, I don't know. What about the persistent factions that remain? And how do we figure when those differences between them are legitimate and when they're not legitimate? And then, even if we can agree, we should all agree we should do something, what should we do? There's going to be competing priorities. There's going to be multiple alternative paths we can follow, and then uncertainties about the costs and benefits of going down any of those paths. So it's not as simple as like making a cake or applying a recipe, applying the science. Remember the paradox formulation of this? In a nutshell, we said, or in a model, the iron triangle, politicians want to please everybody if they can. So they're hoping that the science will speak clearly and everybody will agree to it. So they say, hey, what does the science say? Scientists from Daniel Sarowitz, remember this, produce an excess of objectivity. Advocates then can pick up on studies that say A and studies that say not A. They give it to the politicians and the politicians say, oh, let's do more science, right? And that's the way maybe gridlock and the status quo are perpetuated. So that's one way of understanding climate politics. But then we had this propaganda theory, and we said, there's another way of understanding climate politics. And these aren't mutually exclusive, right? I think a lot of stuff is going on at the same time. But this is obviously also going on, right? You have the carbon industrial complex, a broad sweep of fossil fuel industries, the politicians that they influence, the think tanks that are doing the influencing. They've got money, they've got media influence. They can do a lot of things. They can fund junk science by fringe scientists to lead to uncertainty. They can fund alternative media spheres. They can take advantage of the doctrine of neutrality in traditional media to get their voices represented as equivalent, even though that's a false equivalency. And this can destroy political consensus that would be the political will for action. They can then fund campaign contributions and lobbyists to perpetuate the status quo and keep friendly politicians in power. That stuff is going on, no doubt about it. Another big thing we talked about in this class, I put it as, are we screwed or are we not screwed? And you wrote some great essays about this, really thoughtful essays. Another way to say, is ecomodernism right? In other words, will green growth, decoupling save the day? You know, the drawdown report that we've been reading, I want to say to you, is kind of a really smart exercise in ecomodernism. It's applying existing technology and coming up with some new innovations to decarbonize the economy, not degrow it. Right? What are the major policy platforms we talked about? Well, we talked about 4 levers of the Kaya identity, and I've got a little bit more coming up. I've already mentioned the 3 buckets: mitigation, adaptation, geoengineering. So kind of no matter what policy plan you've got, these are the kind of tools that you have to use, right? The big policy plans out there, we talked about the Paris Agreement, the Green New Deal, this new Standards, Investment, and Justice, SIJ framework, this kind of new consensus on the American left, at least, from making carbon expensive to making carbon-free stuff cheap, right? Then we talk about electrifying everything as a really interesting way of going about climate policy. I also wanted to impress on you that elections matter. You know, we consider the vast differences in the climate platforms between the Trump and the Biden campaigns. I know you're going to miss stuff like this. I don't know what you're going to do without Adam throwing at you weird, I don't know, equations and graphs and data. One more time, the Kaya identity, another thing you can kind of take away from this class. Here are the 4 levers, right? If you want to control carbon in the atmosphere, dangerous anthropogenic interference, right? Well, you can target population, you can target wealth, you can target the amount of energy used to create wealth, that is the energy intensity or energy per unit of GDP. And fourth, you can target the carbon intensity of that energy, the carbon per unit energy. And primarily, I would say those last 2 are what we focus on. Those are kind of the instrumentalist ethics of ecomodernism. We're going to get more efficient economies. Remember Jevons paradox, okay, with efficiency and the rebound effect. And we're going to get carbon-free energy. That's, I think, the gamble of modern civilization when it comes to climate change. And then look, I had to throw this in there, I know. Aren't you going to miss Sankey diagrams? These are also useful things. I hope that we talked about how to read these things. You know, just where is all the carbon coming from? You see a lot of it's transportation, electricity. Look, electricity, 24.6%, electricity and heat. That's like low-hanging fruit, right? So from the drawdown report, look at that. If we could just get everything that's now fossil fuel-based electricity and heat off of carbon-based, that would make a huge difference in terms of our climate goals, right? It would be a big step towards them. So one more Sankey diagram for you to look at. Last question, what are you going to do? You know, I wake up wondering this all the time. In your own private life, you have choices to make, right? Not for me to tell you how to live your life. It's for you to figure out. You ought to be thoughtful about it. And in our public lives, you know, there's choices to make. One thing we talked about is the power of elections, the power of the vote that you have. But there's other things, organizing, right? Getting part of bigger community, part of a bigger picture thing that's going on. Find your skills, find your passions, and plug them into something that's going on, right? And no matter what you do, critical thinking and clear speaking and listening, I think, are super important. Leave you with this quote from Annie Dillard. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing. So what are you doing, right? That's, I think, what I want you to walk away thinking about. Okay. One more time, Akbar reminds us that critical thinking is the greatest weapon the resistance has. And I hope after the pandemic, I get to see you all in real life. You know how to get a hold of me on email and in the cyberspace. Hit me up if you got any questions. I wish you all the very best, and may the force be with you.